This video is about spaces. It corresponds to section 7.12.6 of Applied Analog Electronics. Now I'm going to be talking about spaces in LaTeX, and that really covers two different concepts. One concept is spaces on the input file in the .tex file, and the other is spaces that are visible in the output file, the PDF file. And these two types of spaces don't necessarily correspond to each other. And so what I'm going to be talking about is one, when you have to pay attention to spaces in the LaTeX file and the input, and how you get the desired spacing in the output file. Now, the thing to know about spaces in the input file is that LaTeX really treats all white space as equivalent. Whether you got a tab, 2 spaces, 3 spaces, 1 space, they're all the same. And that means you can't control the output by just saying, oh, I'll put in an extra space here. That doesn't change anything as far as the input is concerned. The other thing you should be aware of is that if you've got a command that's a backslash command and it's ended with a space, that space disappears. Let me show you what I mean. If you use \ohm, which is the command that I defined in the overleaf file that I provided as an example to produce the capital omega. If I say \ohm and with just space in between there, there'll be no space in the output because the \ohm swallows any white space after it because it's just being used to terminate the command. You can avoid that problem by putting an empty pair of braces after it. That now terminates the command, and if you do space and, the space is still there. Okay, so the other thing you should be aware of is doing a new line doesn't get you anything in LaTeX. It just gets you the same thing as a space, unless you do two. If you do a blank line on the input is interpreted as a paragraph break. And that's how you normally produce paragraphs in LaTeX, is you just leave a blank line. Other than that, if you just go to the new line without doing a full blank line, then you're just continuing the same thing. It's just the same thing as if you typed a space. Okay, so that's it for input. Fairly straightforward, but doesn't give you a lot of control. What sort of spaces do we have on output? Well, there's basically two types. One is sort of the word separating, which is the normal spaces that you would have just between words in a sentence. And then there's sentence ending. Sentence ending spaces, this is something that a lot of people debate about on the web all the time. You see people claiming, oh, you should do 1 space for the end of a sentence. No, you should do 2 spaces for the end of the sentence. And the answer is, they're both wrong. Sentence ending spaces are slightly larger than word separating spaces. The most important feature of those is that they're more stretchable. So that if you're doing justified text, the sentence ending spaces stretch or shrink more than the word separating spaces. Particularly, they stretch more. And LaTeX does this automatically. Word separating spaces and sentence ending spaces behave just the way they should. Except for one little problem. LaTeX has to guess whether something is a sentence ending space. And it'll do like, oh, there's a period here. And that's probably the end of a sentence. And sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. For instance, if you have something like abbreviation for a title, that period after professor is not sentence ending, but LaTeX would think it is. So you have to be able to force something to be a word separating space. And there are two ways to force that. You can do a backslash space, which says this is a word separating space, just standard space. Or you can do tilde. Tilde is even more special than the word separating space. It's going to produce the same size space as backslash space, but it's non-breakable. That means you can't have a line or a page break happening at that space. So you can't have prof period at the end of one line and then carplus at the beginning of the next line. This whole thing becomes one word, with that space in there being a place where it's not allowed to break the line. And that's often very useful, particularly in constructs like this one. You also use it in things like if you want to refer to a figure in somebody else's document, you would say figure tilde 2 to make that an unbreakable space so the 2 doesn't get separated from the rest. This construct, you shouldn't need to type it yourself, because if you use the \figref command that I provided in the overleaf example, it expands to figure with an unbreakable space in it anyway. If you absolutely need a sentence ending space, I believe you can force one with \@ sign. I've never used that. I've sometimes had to prevent sentence ending spaces. I've never had to force one. Okay, what other things do you know about spaces? There are times when you want to have a thin space or a thick space. The thin space I like to use before units. So if I want to say 2.2 kiloohms, I would do 2.2 and then \, comma for the thin space, and then the lowercase k and my command for the omega. So the \, comma gives you a thin space, and this is an unbreakable space. So that's one of the nice things about this, is that it gives you the number and the units a little bit closer together, so it looks more like they belong together rather than being separate words, without running them right into each other, which also looks wrong. But it doesn't allow you to break the line between the number and the unit, because that would look really terrible to see 2.2 at the end of a line with no unit, and then a unit by itself at the beginning of the next line. Just doesn't work. The thick space, I use that occasionally in math formulas, where I've got thin spaces for numbers and units, and I want to do thick space to indicate a multiplication that doesn't come out quite right with just the juxtaposition in the normal math formulas. So I sometimes use thick spaces in math formulas. And if you want a normal space, like I said before, that's \, space or tilde, depending whether you want it to be breakable or non-breakable. The \, comma, \, semicolon, and tilde are all non-breakable. \, space, and I believe \@ sign are breakable. There are a lot of other ways to produce spaces in LaTeX. There are ways you can produce spaces of a particular length, \h space, but you very rarely need them unless you're designing the format for something. If you're just typing an ordinary report, most of those choices have been already made for you by the document designer, and all you have to do is give the semantically meaningful ones, like where you want to have something that LaTeX would think is sentence ending actually be just word separating, or where you want to do a thin space, or where we want to force something to be a non-breakable space. So spacing in LaTeX is actually fairly straightforward, particularly if you get into the habit of things like \, comma anytime there's you're putting a number with a unit, and I like to use tilde any place there's something that might be confused with the sentence ending space but isn't supposed to be. Have fun with your spaces. They're pretty easy in LaTeX. It gives you a lot of control without requiring a lot of thinking on your part.